And yes, George Washington stayed in that house on 3 different occasions. No wonder he's the father of the country. That guy slept everywhere. Now this is Benefit Street. This was the very first street paved for the benefit of the citizens of Providence. Prior to that, it was known as Back Street, and this is where all the family cemetery plots used to be. And this is our mile of history. We have more historic properties on this street than any city in America. And you'll notice the plaques on them that will tell you when they were built and who lived there. Over here on the left is the Unitarian Church from 1700. And the steeple of this church contains the largest bell ever cast by the Paul Revere and Sons foundry. You won't be able to see it from here. I'll show you when we get a little further down. But this neighborhood degenerated into almost a slum. And it wasn't until the 70s, when they got kind of gentrified, they started redoing these properties. They just finished restoring that one. They did a great job. The red brick house on the corner here, this was the home of General Ambrose Burnside. And I'll tell you more about him when we see his statue. But he designed that home. You can see the way it flows right down the hill there. On the left, this was the estate of John Brown. He was one of the 4 Brown brothers. And he initially made all his money in the triangle and slave trade. But he was a great patriot. He was one of the Sons of Liberty. Abigail Adams called that the finest home in America. But she was doing jello shots at the time, so who knows. And that's a national landmark. That's on a par with the White House or Graceland. Thank you very much. And the funny thing about John Brown, he loved squirrels because he thought they were very industrious and hardworking. So when that home was first completed in the foyer, he had a huge statue of a squirrel. Sounds kind of nutty. And that house was designed by his brother Joseph, but neither John nor Joseph would live long enough to see it finished. Over here on the left, this used to be the carriage house for the John Brown estate. But what this is most famous as, this was the last residence of our former mayor, Vincent Buddy Cianci, before he went on a 4.5-year vacation. Now, if you don't know the Buddy story, he was one of the longest-serving mayors in America, 21 years. He was voted out of office once because of corruption in his administration, and then re-elected. Then he was charged with 27 counts of corruption under the RICO Act and found guilty of 1. So when he left that residence, he ended up moving to a gated community in New Jersey for 4.5 years. But he's back in town, he's a free man, he does a talk show, he's got a little doggy named Rico, and they're filming a major motion picture about him based on the book The Prince of Providence. And Buddy's writing his own book, which could really be good because he knows more secrets than the Nile. Now, if you look to the left there, all those red brick buildings, that's where the 7th Hill of Providence ended up. Back in colonial days, this was called Town Street, and this was the major artery of the city. Coming up on the left, the Red House, that was the home of George Corliss. And his claim to fame, during the Industrial Revolution, he invented a governor system for a steam engine that made it run smoothly. And after that, they didn't always have to build the mills by rivers. And how the Industrial Revolution started, Moses Brown let Samuel Slater borrow the money to start his mill, and the rest is history. Over there on the right, there's a stone that says HMS Gaspee. And the Gaspee was a British revenue collecting ship that was harassing the local guys. And in June of 1772, there was a tavern right there, Sabin's Tavern. And John Brown and his captains were in there drinking one night, and they got word that the Gaspee was chasing one of the local guys and had run aground. And she wouldn't be able to free herself till the morning tide. So they rowed out, shot the captain, and burnt the ship to the waterline. The American Revolution started in Providence, not in Boston. In Boston, they only dressed up like Indians and hummed show tunes and threw tea in the water. They were girly men in Boston. These guys were burning ships. Hemingway's Restaurant, one of the premier seafood restaurants in America. I was in there a couple of weeks ago and I said to the waiter, "Do you serve crabs?" He said, "Sir, we serve anyone." This was the house of Joseph Brown. He was one of the 4 Brown brothers, and he used to teach architecture at Brown University. And he designed his brother's estate, his house, the First Baptist Church, and the oldest commercial building. This is our Supreme and Superior Court all in one building. We're a small state, we can do that. If you lose your appeal, you don't have to go anywhere. My wife tells me I lost my appeal years ago. Now these little gray buses, these are the ones you don't want your kids riding on, because they'll take you out to Cranston, Rhode Island, to that famous Italian college called What's the Matter You? Memorial Park to our left, that's our World War I, World War II, and Korean War memorials. We're the land of the free because of the brave. Now coming up here on the left is the oldest commercial building, 1773, designed by Joseph Brown. And back in colonial days, those arches are all open. That was an open-air farmer's market. And the second floor would eventually become our first city hall. And we used to barrack French troops there during the Revolutionary War. And without the assistance of the French, we never would have prevailed in that struggle. So that's only appropriate. That sits next to the World War I and World War II memorials. That's the new addition to the RISD Museum. And there's a store there called RISD Works. And you can buy works of art from the faculty and students of Rhode Island School of Design. You can spend from $40 in there to $40,000. And the museum is great. They have a lot of antiquities. And my father always thought that I was going to be an archaeologist. He always used to tell me my life was in ruins. Now we're going to be back at the First Baptist Church again. And the steeple of this church was built by out-of-work ship's carpenters from Boston. The British had the port of Boston blockaded, so these guys didn't have any work. So they come down here and they built this steeple. They did a fairly good job too. It's 185 feet tall. They built it in 3.5 days. And in all the storms and hurricanes we've had, it's never moved more than 4 inches. And they built it like a telescope. They built it in 3 sections. And they jacked the first section into place, jacked the second section through that, and then the third. When the church was first completed, it could accommodate 1/4 of the population of Providence. But now when Brown has their commencement, only the graduating class gets to go inside. The parents have to watch on closed-circuit TV. That's sort of the ultimate pay-per-view. Now, the way that Roger Williams set up his colony was a little different than most New England towns. Most New England towns have a town square, and everything's built around that. Old Roger set it up so your house would be on the water, your farmland behind that, and the very last thing would be your family cemetery plot. And that's what Benefit Street used to be. So when they paved it, they had to move all those bodies out of there. They ended up filling up an entire cemetery. Must have been quite an undertaking. Over here on the right is our first State House. And on those steps up there, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington made speeches trying to talk us into signing on to the Constitution. We were the first colony to renounce allegiance to the Crown. We were actually an independent country for 2 months. And we were the last colony to sign on to the Constitution. We wouldn't sign on until the Bill of Rights was added, limiting the power of government. We had more rights than all the other colonies because of Roger Williams, and we weren't going to give anything up. So when we finally signed on, George Washington came down here and threw a big ball for the citizens. Boy, that's the nice thing about vodka. They can't smell it on your breath. That's also where the first anti-slavery laws were passed. There were 4 Brown brothers. Charlie Brown was not one of them, but Moses Brown was. And he was married to a Quaker lady. And the Quakers were adamantly against slavery. And his daughter and his wife died very young, and he saw that as God punishing him for being involved with slavery. So he freed all his slaves, and he was instrumental in getting the first anti-slavery laws passed. One of the first guys brought up on charges was his brother John. So that must have made for some interesting conversations. Over here on the left, this was the original settlement. There's none of the original structures left. But if you look at the street here to the right, you can kind of visualize what it must have looked like back then. And this is part of the land that Roger Williams bought from the Indians. And he wanted this particular piece of land because it had a freshwater spring on it. Now this is now a federal park. It's one of the smallest ones in America, only 4.5 acres. It only requires the services of 1 ranger. I call him the Lone Ranger. And every year, the Lone Ranger plants these crops. He plants corn, beans, and squash. And that's what the settlers used to call the 3 sisters, because they're keeping a root cellar, keep you going for the winter. If you look through the window there, you'll see a copy of the book that Roger Williams wrote that became a bestseller in England. I don't know how many copies you had to sell back then to be a bestseller. But he was the first guy that bothered to learn the Indian language, and he wrote that book about it. He even financed a couple of trips back to England on his own to go fight for Indian rights. And if you want to see what happens if you don't protect your borders, language, and culture, just ask the Indians. Now there's a little river here. This is the Mashasik River. And in Indian it means where the moose comes to drink. I think they drink at Murphy's nowadays. But that's the river that Roger Williams and a handful of followers paddled up, and Chief Canonicus greeted them with the now famous "What cheer Neetop?" And what cheer is on the city seal. It means what news. Some people claim it really means there goes the neighborhood. Over here on the left is our State House, and on top of the State House is the second largest unsupported marble dome in the world, only surpassed by the Taj Mahal. And it's built like an igloo, and it's just the shape and weight of the stones that keep it in place. There's not any crazy glue or bolts or anything. And on top of the dome is the statue of the independent man, and he reflects Rhode Island's independent spirit. They originally wanted to put a statue of Roger Williams up there, but nobody knew what he looked like. He was a very religious man. He wouldn't allow himself to be sculptured or painted because he thought that was too vain. And the building is made out of white Georgian marble. And the reason they picked that particular stone, as it ages, it turns more white and glittery and sparkly, sort of like Michael Jackson. And you can take a walking tour of the State House Monday through Friday. And one of the things you'll see in there is a portrait of George Washington. It's the same one that's on the $1 bill. And it was done by a local guy, Gilbert Stewart. And George Washington, his teeth were made from hippopotamus tusks, and they caused him so much pain he had to drink laudanum all the time, which is an opium derivative. So next time you look at the $1 bill and see that silly smirk on his face, you'll know what the deal is there. Over here on the right is the Providence Renaissance Hotel, just opened up last summer. Travel and Leisure has named that one of the 100 best hotels, and they only picked about 20 in America. But the building itself, construction started on that building in 1926, and it was being built by the Scottish Rite of Mason as the Grand Mason's Temple. When the Depression hit, all construction stopped. The building sat there abandoned until 4 years ago. Thieves stole the copper roof off it, water inundated the building, ruined the building. They only could save 3 sides. And there's 2 different stories on that. Some people will tell you the Masons just ran out of money before the Depression, and some people claim the Grand Mason absconded with the funds, which is another old Providence tradition. Now, before the State House was built here, this was the site of a prison, and the last time the state of Rhode Island executed a prisoner was on that spot. Unfortunately, several years later, a guy on his deathbed confessed to actually doing the murder. I hate it when that happens. We used to keep despicable criminals there. Now we keep politicians. I see a trend. When they were digging the Providence Place Mall, they unearthed some of the cells that used to go along with the prison. Over there to the left through the trees, that's our train station. There's a high-speed train that runs to Boston. You can be there in about an hour. Now over here on the left on the skyline, there's a building that looks like a miniature Empire State Building. And that was built in 1928 as the Industrial Trust Bank Building. And they were only trying to make it taller than the Biltmore Hotel. But they ended up building the tallest building in New England for almost 20 years. And that was used in the 1932 version of King Kong and also Citizen Kane. And if you look over the rail down here, you're looking down into Water Place. And that's where they start the water fire ceremonies. There's also a nice walk that goes all along the river there. And a lot of times, if they don't have $150,000 for a full water fire, they'll just light the ones in the basin. Over here on the left is the brand new headquarters of the G-Tech Corporation, and they run lotteries all over the world. Sounds like a pretty good business to be in. And the nice thing about the lottery is whether you buy a ticket or not, you have just about the same chance of winning. And if you look through the window, you'll see over 80 different flags, and that represents all the countries they run the lotteries in. There's a sky bridge over here. Over 1 million people a year use that sky bridge. Coming up here on the right is the Courtyard by Marriott. This is a new building designed to look like the old train station that burnt down. It actually burned down twice. Back in its heyday, Providence was the 12th richest city in America. Over 300 trains a day used to stop here. On the left is yet another condo. Some people claim that looks like a Moscow apartment building. It's not so bad now, but a few years ago, if you didn't lock your car at night, when you come out in the morning, there would have been a condo in it. The fieldstone over here on the right, that's about all that's left of the original train station. Now coming up here on the left is kind of an irregularly shaped building, and it's shaped like that because it sits on the confluence of three rivers, and it's designed to look like the bow of a ship coming up the bay. And that's the Citizens Bank building. And that's where you catch the gondolas on a water fire night. And the gondolas will run you up to $200 an hour. What a deal this trolley is. Unbelievable. If I could sing in Italian, I could get the big bucks. Now we're a convention city, and they're trying to get to the next level convention. And the only way you do that is build more hotel rooms. That little piece of land right there, that just sold for just under $2 million. And there's a 5-story hotel with parking going in there. Just last summer alone, we had 500 new hotel rooms come online. I'll tell you, they are building them everywhere. Now back in 1928, we had a hurricane. It was the worst natural disaster to hit New England. Almost 600 people lost their lives. The water rose 18 feet in 3 hours. It rose up to just below the sills of the windows on this building here. And as you're walking around Providence, there's several different buildings with plaques on them that will show you how deep the water was. And there's a red brick structure right here that contains pictures of Providence flooded 3 different times by different hurricanes. When we get down by the water, I'll show you what they did to make sure it never happens again. That's our World War I memorial. That was a gift from the citizens of Italy. Now over to the left is the church steeple, and that's the one that contains the largest bell ever cast by Paul Revere and Sons Foundry. The gold roof building, that used to be the Old Stone Bank, and that now belongs to Brown University. And last I heard, they're going to move their anthropology department in there. Over there on the right is Capriccio's restaurant, very famous Italian restaurant. And they say that's where the rich, the famous, and the infamous go to eat. I don't fall in any of those categories. I've never been in there. But in another lifetime, I used to be a duck boat captain. And I always had this little fantasy. I always wanted to take the duck and pull up the valet parking, slip the guy the keys, go in and have a huge meal, everything soup and nuts. And then when they brought the check, I could have told them, put it on my bill. Then I could have ducked out. Let us slide a few duck jokes in, just for old time's sake. This is the jewelry district of the city. Providence used to be the premier manufacturer of costume jewelry. Now most of that work is all moved offshore. But over here on the right, you're going to see all the old factory buildings. And they're being bought up by Brown Medical School and Johnson & Wales University. We have 7 major colleges and universities in the city, and 14 in the state. And now that the kids are back in session, we have about 39,000 more bodies in town than what we normally have. The guy that owns Extra Mod just donated $100 million to Brown Medical School. So they're going to name their microbiology department after him. If anyone would like a trolley named after them, please come see me after the tour. We'll work something out. Now over here on the left, this used to be the coal-fired power plant for the city. And that hasn't been a power plant in years. They're turning that into a hotel. It's going to be called Dynamo House. More power to them. It's also going to be retail space and condos and a Smithsonian Museum. And there used to be smokestacks in the back that they took down. And they're going to build replica smokestacks. And incorporated in these smokestacks is going to be lasers. And at night they're going to change color. And it's on a computer program where you'll never have the same sequence of color twice. And if that's all you had to worry about, you'd be a very lucky individual. Now up ahead of us, you're going to see a bunch of construction. And when this construction is complete in 2012, it's going to open up about 30 acres of land for development, including 9 waterfront acres. And there's great consternation right now over who's going to get it and what are they going to do with it. Right now it's zoned heavy industry. We have a shipyard down here and some fuel transfer facilities. But the same guys that redesigned the inner harbor in Baltimore want to get in here and build condos and shops and restaurants. And they're talking about making it a port of call for cruise ships. And no one's come right out and said casino yet, but I think that's the way it's headed. Now, when this light changes, if you look down this street to the left, you'll see a big, huge bridge. And this bridge was built in one piece, 12 miles south of here. It was there this morning. There it is. And it was delivered just the way you see it there. It's 400 feet long, 185 feet high, and it weighs 5.5 million pounds. And they built it at an old Navy base on a pier. And how they got it up here, they took a couple of barges, and they sort of made a catamaran out of the barges. And they wheeled that bridge out on the barges, then they jacked it up 35 feet in the air. And they brought it up here with tugboats, lined it up to where it wanted to sit, and they just flooded the barges with water and lowered it in place one shot. Piece of cake, nothing to it. Over there on the left, that's where our Russian submarine is. It's 282 feet long, and has spent the past 15 months sitting on the bottom because it sank. I knew when they put the screen doors on it there was going to be problems. And that's one of the reasons we don't have a dock anymore. That was the only ramp we could use, and that's been closed for almost 2 years since the sub sank. Over here on the left, this big pile, this is the salt they put on the road in the winter. And they bring about 280,000 tons of that stuff in here before every winter. Now, a lot of salt comes from mines. This particular salt comes from the Bahamas. They have a big pit, about 2,000 acres. And they flood it with seawater. When the water evaporates, that's the salt that's left. It's called solar safe salt. And you'll notice it's covered because they have to keep it covered, especially on a water fire night. Or else the people of Providence get down there and start making margaritas and playing Jimmy Buffett music and just raising hell. It's never pretty. But I'm going to show you where you catch the high-speed ferry that will take you down to Newport. It will get you down there in just about an hour. And it's only $12 each way because it's subsidized by the local bus company. And they even have a bar on board. You talk about a win-win. There's one of the Green City trolleys. We get you down here in time to catch the ferry. Then when you come back, there'll be another trolley waiting to take you back to the city. But you got to hurry because it ends the 15th of this month for the year. Now over there to the right, you'll see a red tugboat tied up at a big long stone jetty. And that's known as India Point Park. And that's where the Brown brothers had their shipyard back in the colonial days. The majority of the slaves were brought to the West Indies, so they started calling the sailors Indian men. That's where India Point came from. Now someone's going to park an asphalt ship right in the way of what I wanted to show you. But as we say on Federal Hill, make a believe that ship wasn't there. If you look straight where that ship is now, you'd see a bunch of three-decker houses. And there was a bunch of people from Cork Island when they emigrated settled there. Matter of fact, years ago, they used to call that Corky Point. And that was the birthplace of George M. Cohan, I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy, and also Nelson Eddy. Any Nelson Eddy fans aboard? No, that's too bad. I do a rendition of Indian Love Call that would bring tears to your eyes. I don't want to brag, but when I do the Jeanette MacDonald part, I've had strong men just weep openly. Supposedly it's more effective than pepper spray. But if you look to the head of the bow of the ship, I know you can't see it from here. There's a gray building elevated there. Can you see that? And just behind it, it's kind of hard to see because it's the same color as the mud on the bottom, is the Russian submarine. It's kind of a brownishy gray. You can just see the silhouette of the sail. And the Navy found out we had a sunken Russian sub in 40 feet of water, so they made a diving exercise out of it. And they burrowed in the mud underneath the sub so they could pass big straps around it. And they had 8 great big lifting engines. Then they had these huge balloon kind of things, and they attached to the strap, and they blew up for buoyancy. And about 2 weeks ago, they managed to raise her in one piece. And supposedly it's the first time they've ever successfully recovered a Russian sub. And right now they're stripping some of the equipment off her because they're going to have to scrap her. She won't be any good for the tourist trade anymore. But I don't know if you can see, oh yeah, I don't know if you can see us now with the ship there. But to the right of that elevated building, there's a roof there with brown trim on it. And that's known as Fox Point. Roger Williams allowed the Quakers to settle there. None of the other colonies would accept them. They were hanging them up in Boston. They were sort of like Yankee fans back then. And they named that after their leader in England, George Fox. And when this construction is complete, they're supposed to build a Cape Cod-style village there with condos and shops. And on the very point, they're going to build a lighthouse. And it's not going to be for navigation or anything. It's going to be the first light for water fire. But when the lighthouse is complete, once a month they're going to bring the high school home economics class down and teach them a little light housekeeping. Now let me introduce you to one of Rhode Island's most famous citizens. Listen to this resume. He's an actor. He was featured in that classic movie, Dumb and Dumber. He's even worked as an ambassador. They loaded him on an 18-wheeler and he visited all the contiguous United States. And he's also the world's largest termite at 58 feet. And if you look above that underpass, you'll see the big blue bug. And that's a famous Rhode Island landmark. And he sits on the roof of a pet extermination company. And a little big blue bug trivia, the big blue bug was originally purple, because the termite at that stage of development is purple, but he bleached out blue in the sun, and by that time the traffic guys started calling him the big blue bug, so they always painted him blue after that. Now the Brown brothers had 84 ships, and one of them was a small merchant vessel named the Katy that they sold to the Continental Congress, became the first warship of the United States. It was known as the Providence. Narragansett Bay is the cradle of the United States Navy. And if you look to the right of that blue Michelin sign, you'll see a 110-foot fiberglass replica of the Providence. And the Providence was the first American command to John Paul Jones. First time U.S. Marines ever made an amphibious landing was off the Providence. And in the course of her service, she captured and sank over 40 British vessels. And she ended up being scuttled by her crew up in Penobscot, Maine, to keep from falling into British hands. A couple of years ago, they recovered the bell from her. And if you look to the right of the Providence, hiding behind a little tree there, there's a tugboat being converted to a private yacht. And that originally belonged to the guy that owns MonsterBoard.com. And last I heard, the yard bill was over $4 million. And like they say in the yard, no cash, no splash. If you look straight down this pier, you're looking at another pier across the way there, and there's a pipe system that runs all the way to Boston from there. And you'll see a fuel barge or a big tanker pull in there and tie up, and they're actually pumping their cargo to Boston from there. Now over here on the left in the shipyard, there's a travel lift there. And that will lift 300 metric tons. And they're buying a bigger one, $2.5 million. And it's too bad we can't see this any better, but behind that white Quonset hut looking thing, you'll see the mast of a schooner. And that's a schooner out of Maine. And she's a replica of a Grand Banks fishing schooner. And that's something you hardly ever see nowadays. But the pier where that travel lift is, that's the old State Pier number 1. And that's known as the Ellis Island of Rhode Island. Thousands and thousands of immigrants. That was the very first place they stepped foot in America. There was a ship that ran directly from Europe to there. And a lot of French and Italians and Greeks, that's where they first made their debut. Now if you look over here up in the rigging of the Providence, you'll see all the puffy stuff on the lines. And that's called baggy wrinkle. And they put that on there so the sails won't chafe and make a hole. And that's what I used to call my mother-in-law, old baggy wrinkle. But that vessel belongs to the city of Providence, and it kind of languished in the shipyard for lack of funding, just like it's doing now. But movie makers called up, and they were making Pirates of the Caribbean too, and they wanted to use that in the movies. So they paid $400,000 for the privilege. And they got their money's worth because the port side they painted up like a British man of war, and the starboard side they painted up like a Turkish merchant ship. And the crew was either dressed in rags or in British Navy uniforms, depending on what they were filming that day. Now this is the northernmost part of Narragansett Bay. It runs 26 miles to the south where it meets Mother Ocean. It's the second deepest natural harbor in America, only surpassed by Puget Sound. We're the smallest state, but we got over 400 miles of coastline. There's 26 islands in the bay, and 4 of them are named Patience, Prudence, Hope, and Despair. And years ago, one guy owned all those islands. Patience, Prudence, and Hope were named after his 3 daughters, and Despair Island was named after the fact he didn't have a male heir. And I feel a certain kinship with that poor devil, because just in case you don't think that God has a sense of humor, I ended up with 6 daughters and a son. The girl who sold you tickets is one of them. And if you want to come to my funeral, you're all invited. There'll be plenty of room. You can watch her and her sisters river dance on my grave. Now this is our hurricane barrier. There's big steel doors that are folded home right now. But if we're going to have a hurricane, they'd fold those across the road, then they'd close the barrier out there. And that would keep all the water on that side. That's a great thing. The only problem then, the Providence River couldn't flow out, and that would flood the city. In that barrier, they have 5 pumps, and each one of these pumps is about the size of a 3-decker house. And when they're all pumping in unison, they'll pump 3,200,000 gallons of water a minute. Looks like the Colorado River, and that's what sank the Russian sub. It was a year ago spring. It was a spring equinox tide, and a storm hit. So they closed the barrier and let the pumps off. And the sub wasn't properly tied up, so she broke her lines and went aground. And they had cut big holes in the pressure hull to let the tourists up and down. So when she went aground, the bow went up, naturally the stern went down, and she filled up with water and rolled over on her port side. And even though she was built in 1963, the Russians still wouldn't let them look at the plans. They claimed it was still secret. That's why they weren't quite sure if they could pick it up without breaking it. If you saw the movie K-19, The Widowmaker with Harrison Ford, that's the stuff they used in the movies. Now if you look up here about 2 blocks, you'll see an old factory building with a dragon on the top of it. And that's the way I felt last night. I was dragging. And if we look up the street here, that's Dory the Dragon. If you can look up the side, somebody parked the truck there. And just the other side of that white truck, you can see Dory's face. There's her face. And Dory sits on top of the Children's Museum. And that was voted one of the 20 best children's museums in America. And we also have a great zoo, the Roger Williams Park Zoo. We have one of the oldest carousels in America, and there's a huge animal collection. And last spring we had a giraffe born, and they made a big deal out of it because it's so rare to have a giraffe born in captivity. Well, later that season, about September, we had another giraffe born. So there's something going on with the giraffes out there at the park. It's probably a long story. Over here on the right, you're going to see a pile of wood, and that's the wood they use in water fire. And most of that is cedar wood because it smells so nice when it's burning. And water fire is supposed to be a treat for all 5 senses. And if you keep looking to the right, you'll see the Point Street Bridge. This is the jewelry district. So they paint the control box on the bridge purple, and that's supposed to look like the gem in a ring. Right across the water here, there's 3 buildings about the same size. Those were John Brown's warehouses. And he opened up the China and India trade, so they would have been full of cargo from all over the world. The round thing across the water there, that's the Dunkin' Donuts Memorial. No, that's not true, I lied. We have the School of Design here in the city. So as you walk around, you'll see a lot of things like that. It's art. And speaking of art, right over here on the right is the Painted Window Building. They didn't have any windows on this building facing the water. So they hired the School of Design kids to come down here and paint windows on it. And they did a great job, but they shouldn't have used latex. See the way it's peeling up in the corner there? Now, if you look on top of the Painted Window Building, you're looking back at the Industrial Trust Bank Building. And if you look on the right-hand side, about the second setback from the very top, you'll see a greenish structure up there with windows on it. And that used to be the penthouse. And that was designed to look like the gondola car from an airship. When that building was first built in 1928, it was the tallest building in New England. and they had a mast on it for landing airships. But the Hindenburg disaster happened, so they never used it. They took the mast down. And that penthouse there in Providence used to be a speakeasy. Then they were using it as a restaurant, but they couldn't make it handicapped accessible, so they had to close it. But it's still sort of a restaurant, because there's a couple of peregrine falcons that live up there, and they dine on the local pigeon population. Found out they taste like chicken. And the peregrine falcon is the fastest animal in nature. In a dive, they can hit almost 200 miles an hour. I've been in a few dives myself. Now this is Friendship Street, and if you look at the signs, you'll see that in Providence, Friendship is a one-way street. The falcons have 3 young this year. And in the afternoon, you can see them fly. I saw them just before we left on the tour. And the young are as big as the parents now. They have about a 10-foot wingspan. And it's almost prehistoric to see them flying around there. We have 2 nesting sets of peregrine falcons. These guys and another set live in the Mount Hope Bridge. Now this side of Providence wasn't settled till the 1800s because this was the Great Salt Cove and the swamp. So everything you see here is built on pilings because the land was so swampy. And down this street you'll see some cobblestones that go back to the original settlement. And that's about the only piece of cobblestone left in the city. And if you have your camera ready, we're going to have a Kodak moment in just a second here. I'll stop in front of the reflective windows of the Johnson & Wales Library. You'll be able to get a picture of yourself on the trolley. You can treasure it always. When the kids want to have you committed, it'll be the first thing they show the judge. And this guy went and parked a gas truck right in.
Come on this
He
side.
really messed us up. We can pull ahead a little bit. Maybe we can fix this. Now that isn't too good, but if you look to the left, you'll see a bunch of people on a trolley. Nice looking group too, except the homely guy driving. I was such a homely kid. My mother used to take me to work with her, just so she didn't have to kiss me goodbye. I had the only incubator with smoked glass. I thought it was for privacy, I didn't know. Now I showed you a pile of wood. If that wasn't exciting enough, if you look up here to the left, there's an empty lot. And up until 3 years ago, there was a building there with a restaurant. And the chef was braising beef. He managed to braise the entire bloody building. The fire was so bad they had to tear it down. And that building went back to 1860. It was our first teachers' college, but they couldn't save it. Now over here on the right is the Federal Reserve. This is no longer a bank. They have wedding receptions and catered affairs. And if you're going to have an affair, have it catered. Spend the money, for God's sakes. But if you look up over the door, you'll see the carving of the Puritan and the Indian. And that depicts Roger Williams, meaning Chief My Aunt Nomi. And they must have really hit it off because they're both looking in different directions. And on the corner of the building, there's a plaque there that will show you how deep the water was in the '38 hurricane. That was the only bank in Providence that had a dry vault. Now up here on the left is a tradition that goes back to 1888, Haven's Brothers Diner. I bet it's here because they're shooting the Brotherhood, but it normally doesn't get here till nighttime. And it's the oldest continuous diner service in America. It was originally a horse and wagon. And when the horse died, the hamburgers are on sale for 3 weeks. Now this is where the Great Salt Cove is. It's underneath Kennedy Plaza here. Over here to the left is City Hall. This used to be in the Guinness Book of World Records as the widest bridge in the world. It wasn't wide this way, it was wide that way. It was 3/4 of a mile. But when they opened up the river back in the 70s, we lost that title. But over on the left is City Hall. And before 9/11, they used to have a tour they do with the City Hall, and they'd take you in the basement and open a hatch and actually show you the water underneath. And if you look up high there on City Hall, I bet you'll see Roger Williams peeking out at you with a little Puritan hat on. Over here on the right is Kennedy Plaza. That's our transportation hub. Anything you want to know about the high-speed ferry or trolleys or buses, they'll be happy to help you, unless the crabby lady's working today. Over here on the left is Burnside Park, and the fountain in the park, it was cast by the Gorham Silver Company and placed there in 1899. There was an Italian diplomat who was married to a local lady who died very young. She was actually a descendant of Nicholas Brown's. And that's supposed to signify his eternal tears and grief at her passing. That's before he met his new friend, 26-year-old spokesmodel Tammy with an eye. Now this is Burnside Park, and the statue of the man on the horse, that's General Ambrose Burnside. We saw his red brick house up on Benefit Street, and what he was most famous for was the way he wore his beard. His name was Burnside, and his men behind his back used to call him sideburns. And that's where the expression comes from. He had him before Elvis. That's true. They had a festival here a few weeks ago. One of the things they had was a General Burnside facial hair look-alike contest. And I was just so happy that the lady who won it 2 years ago didn't get it again this year. But if you look to the left, you'll see Burnside's backside. And if you look in the back of the statue, you can see the sideburns sticking out from the side of his face. I'm serious about that. And if you keep looking over to the left, up back to City Hall, up on the mansard roof, you'll see those round windows. And since that predates telephone and electricity and everything else, when they were going to have a city meeting, they used to place flags out those windows. Over here on the left is our ice skating rink, which is actually bigger than Rockefeller Center. And again on the left is the Grand Old Lady of Providence, the Biltmore Hotel. And when they had the grand opening for that back in the 20s, they covered it with 25,000 white lights. Another time, up in the ballroom, which is on the top floor, they built a pool, and Esther Williams put on a swimming display. Not Roger, Esther. Another time in that ballroom, they made an ice skating rink, and that's where the very first ice follies were held. Now ahead of us and on the left, this is the Wall of Hope. Hope is the state motto. And these tiles were done by school children all over Rhode Island, and that reflects their thoughts on the 9/11 attack on Western civilization. Now I have to swear you to secrecy. You cannot tell the ACLU what I'm about to tell you because they'll have a hemorrhage of red paint. But if you ever saw a Rhode Island flag, it's the 13 stars and an anchor and the word hope. And a lot of people just assume it reflects our maritime heritage. Actually, Roger Williams read in Hebrews that hope is the anchor of the soul. But don't tell the commies, they'll be mad as hell. Now that's the brand new tower of the Westin Hotel. That's where Arnold bought his condo, and they're on sale. You can now get yourself a nice little one-bedroom condo there for $420,000, and they go up into the multiples of millions. But you can walk to our trolley from there. So everything is location, location. This is our convention center, and right there's a visitor's information bureau. Anything you want to know about tourism, they'll be happy to help you, unless the crabby lady's working there that day. And if you were to walk straight up here and veer to the right, you'd be up on Federal Hill. Or you could take one of the green city trolleys. And if you like Italian cuisine, you really owe it to yourself to go up there and enjoy a great meal. Italian cuisine has such an effect on Rhode Island that any Chinese restaurant you go in Rhode Island, they give you Italian bread. That's Murphy's Deli. That's the Irish bar with the Jewish deli owned by the Swedish lady with the Italian last name. And they give you a sandwich in there that's huge. Now I have gone to great expense here, and I've hired a spokesmodel. This is actually Vanna White's sister, Lily. And she's going to point out the high water mark. Thank you, Lily. And Lily is actually 6'7". And that's the high water mark from the Thank you, Lily. And straight down here, there's a nice little Irish pub, Daddy McGee's. And if you go in there and tell Jason that I sent you, he'll throw you out of there so fast your head will spin. And that just about concludes the tour. I hope you enjoyed it. Oh, thank you. Thank you. You folks have great taste, I'll say that for you. But if you just remain seated until the trolley comes to a complete stop and this door opens, you can go screaming into the night, wondering why you thought this was going to be such a great idea. The door didn't open, so my lovely assistant will push from the outside. And for that, she went to college. There